Hello and welcome back to the A-KID-EMIA podcast. I'm your host, Charlotte Duffy, and this is episode number 12, also the third in our eight-part series, generously funded by the American Philosophical Association. And you can find us now at A-KID-EMIA Podcast on all your favorite platforms. Today, we're really lucky to have Laura Pritschet on the show. She is a neuroscientist, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and really a cutting-edge researcher on the neuroscience of the brain during pregnancy, as well as the postpartum period. And so Laura comes to share with us some of her findings in a new article, which is the first of its kind to study the human brain during gestation. She also speaks to the wider literature on the postpartum period and how all of this change affects not only mom, but also dad. So it's a really interesting discussion. So here we go. So why don't you just tell people who maybe aren't familiar with your research, sort of what your current position is, and then we'll dive into things.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for reaching out to me. I am so excited to talk to you. With this work, I think it touches so many people, whether they're in science or not, and they want to understand it. And we want to understand it from multiple angles. What do we do with these findings? What does this mean? What does it mean for my life? And where do we need to go still? Because it's a little shocking, right, to know that this paper came out, I guess, last year in 2024, and we hadn't yet studied someone's brain throughout pregnancy, which is a bit shocking. So our finding in our work was really asking low-hanging fruit questions, but the response it got really showcased the need we have to answer these questions and for women to feel seen in science and everyday life. So it's really nice to talk to you. I love the reason for your podcast. I love also thinking about all of this stuff, especially women's health and the history of science, the history of medicine. There's a lot there. But to introduce myself, I am currently a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, and I completed my PhD a couple years ago with Emily Jacobs at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And how I would describe myself is a cognitive neuroscientist who's trying to understand brain dynamics with respect to sex hormones and hormonal transition periods, specifically within women, asking questions like, what is the brain doing over the menstrual cycle? How is it responding to oral contraceptive use? What does it look like over pregnancy? What does it look like over menopause? These questions that have largely been ignored or understudied throughout the history of science. And so that's what I tackle. And what we're talking about today is some sort of the more recent work that I've done and I'm continuing to do, which is trying to understand how the brain changes over pregnancy and into the postpartum period.
Cool. So I want to hear about this paper, but first, for people who aren't at all familiar with, scientific research on pregnant women, they might be shocked by one of the first things you just said, which I was shocked by, that we really don't have that much research on the brains of pregnant women. Can you speak a little bit to why that is? Is this just something that an institutional review board is very loath to give ethics approval to? Or is there something more going on here? Probably a million explanations if I had to guess,
A
but
million explanations. The most feasible, tangible one is exactly what you're saying, which is the idea, the dogma that pregnant women are to be untouched in research settings because there's no benefit to them at all. Missing the forest for the trees here of the more we know about the brain, the more helpful and relief it can have. Specifically so I use non-invasive brain imaging techniques to understand the brain, capture what structure's doing, function. And that requires you to lay in a scanner. We don't use any contrast or any sort of radiation, but there was an idea here that it was not safe for pregnant women to be volunteering for these sorts of studies for a long time. And in fact, in most places, it was just a rule. It was banned. If you go and get your brain scanned at the National Institutes of Health, regardless of if you tell them, I am not pregnant, they will make you take a pregnancy test first. It is something they are very careful about in Europe. They don't allow it to happen. Despite the fact that this happens in clinical care all of the time, we have data, especially when it comes to the safety of the fetus to how this can influence our hearing, how much our body temperature rises. We have that safety data. It's coming out more and more, but because a lot of research institutes are low risk, it was just, we're not even going to touch this. The other thing that can be a bit frustrating is we were trying to explore fetal brain development for a really long time, which requires pregnant women to go into the scanner. They just didn't think to move them up a little bit and simultaneously or also scan their brain. And so we were in a unique position to have a really supportive institutional review board, and we had a woman who was in this space, a scientist in this space who knew the risks, knew how safe it was, knew that we could take precaution and that she could end the study at any time, who said, "No, actually, I'm going to do this. Here's all of the data to say that this is safe. And we need to ask these questions. And I'll just start. I'll be the first person." And that allowed us to study her and scan her brain preconception through her journey with IVF, and then every few weeks throughout pregnancy into about 2 years after birth. And that rate hadn't happened before. Typically, what we'll do to study how pregnancy influences the brain is bring people in preconception and then scan their brains again after births. Sometimes you can get them as early as 3 weeks, or more typically, it's about a month or two after. And so that's really informative in many ways. It gets the big picture, but we did not have an understanding of how the brain was changing in step with those massive rise in hormones, physiological change in just 40 weeks of mystery, really.
Wow, that's it's so unbelievable, actually. Especially to hear you say that in clinical settings we do this a lot. So it does happen. It's just in the research setting, suddenly those sounds like those kind of more litigation concerns, maybe, or
Yeah.
just these sorts of
Yeah.
fears. But to hear you say that it happens, that this prohibition is, sort of geographically ubiquitous is a little
Mhm.
surprising too, because the U.S. context is more litigious than others, but I'm
Yeah.
surprised to hear, frankly, that it's also the case in Europe. So, um,
Yeah.
really interesting. So, okay, so the study published in Nature was on just this one woman who volunteered, who was herself a scientist. Was she part of the research team as well, or she was just acting as subject?
She was, yeah, so she was a colleague in the psychological and brain sciences department we were in. She had then since moved to University of California, Irvine. And yeah, her team actually led one of the analyses to look at white matter in the brain. That's her specialty. She studies spatial navigation. And it's so cool. And I had done something as well, studying my brain over the menstrual cycle. And I think that it's just really cool for these female scientists to say, we are done with the unknown, and I'm going to volunteer. No one's going to tell me no. And I want to know what's happening. And I want to analyze this data too. And it's really cool. And of course, there's a lot in that. And I can speak to that too, of the ethics behind it and all of that. But she was, such a superwoman about it and was very open. We, as a research team, we're quite the unit. And her graduate student led some of this work. So it was really cool.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, so I do some history of medicine, and one of the things that really shocked me is just how much we owe to scientists and doctors over the course of history who have auto-experimented in this way, who have said, you know what, we don't know the risk, I'll be the first one to take it on then. And that's just such a courageous and sacrificial thing. So good for you and your colleague for doing that. So why don't you tell us as best as you can to people like me who aren't in the sciences, what you discovered in this?
Yeah. I can say this in many parts, and I think the biggest through line here is that there are very few regions of the human brain that were untouched by the transition to motherhood. So, one of our major findings, we had her do every single session a structural MRI scan, meaning we'll be able to take a picture of her brain and quantify how much gray matter there is, where the neurons are, how much white matter there is, that insulation of to help with signal transduction between the neurons themselves, cerebral spinal fluid. We can look both cortically and we can look within deep structures of her brain. So, really just getting at that nitty gritty of what is the matter in the brain? What does it look like? What is the distribution? What's the volume? What's the thickness? All of those questions that we know are important for brain health, they're important for cognition and behavior. And what we saw was that as she advanced through her pregnancy, we saw this sort of linear decrease in gray matter volume over that period. So, for many regions of the brain, we would see sort of a decrease in volume and thickness. And interestingly, in parallel, we saw the opposite with white matter. So you can think of the white matter, which, connects, it serves as, like I like to say, insulation between those neurons, started to get bigger. And we saw that sort of rise over pregnancy. And then birth really served as an inflection point where after birth, we started to see that gray matter volume begin to recover, rebound, or rise, however you want to think of it, not to the point of her preconception tissue volume, but still much higher than it was over pregnancy itself. And I think there are many important things to think about when we're saying the word decrease. If you hear gray matter decrease, you're thinking oftentimes that's a bad thing that might relate to, a disorder, disease, the 6 concussions one might have, anything like that. But actually, what these findings, and you got to take them together, it's sort of a choreographed dance of change that's happening in response to pregnancy, is very, very similar to other periods of brain development over the life course. Now, we think of brain development as when you're a fetus, when you are an infant, and when you're an adolescence. But that's not true. That's what our findings are suggesting, and others in the field who have shown something similar in different ways, is that pregnancy is another critical period of brain development where we see this decrease in gray matter volume, but that might not be atrophy. We have a lot of connections in our brain, and not all of them are needed. And to entertain and keep those connections can be very energy demanding. So, how we like to think about it and how we interpret this field of findings, not even just our own data, is that there might be some fine tuning and pruning of circuits in a beneficial way. And we see this with, maybe decreased gray matter volume, but increased in, the improvement of the communication between those neurons themselves. And we see sort of that change in postpartum when those hormones start to, precipitously decline, or go back to normal, you go back to having your cycle or not, but really interesting pattern during the pregnancy period.
That's so interesting to hear. I have 4 children, and I have felt that since I started having children, my research has gotten more creative, even though I recognize like on the day to day, it really feels like I am myself becoming more of a toddler. Like I forget things, I drop things, like this whole thing. So it feels like something has gone down, but something has gone up at the same time. And so I don't know whether, maybe there's some scientific basis for that, but okay, so the brain fine tunes is what you're saying. Can
And
you
I will just jump in to say also with the fine tuning, well, many things. One is we see crazy changes in the brain during pregnancy. These aren't massive, or you're not going to become a totally different your brain is identifiable, but it's in response to a big hormonal change. And we also see this interest in, we always joke about it, in psychedelics, and like networks are changing there and there's plasticity. And we're like, well, yeah, because these are major things. Not to say pregnancy is like psychedelics, but these are becoming more of interest to scientists. But I will say we also root a lot of our findings because I can be clear on what our data can say versus can't say, but I speak also to all of the existing work, especially in animals, where we see similar patterns where they are having a fine tuning of maternal circuitry that relates to then measurable behavioral change. Our field is a little bit weaker in those relationships between identifying these neuroanatomical changes and say maternal attachment, maternal anxiety, or infant bonding. They're there a little bit, but we still have a lot of work to do in that way. But it's really cool to see in animals the one-to-one of that circuit changing that way, and there's an increased sensory response to their pups and things like that.
Wow. So sounds like your findings reflect a lot of what had already been discovered in animals, you're saying, even though there's just less data, so you can't really say it as strongly, maybe? Is that that's what you're saying?
Yeah, I think, our findings, it's really interesting because we don't we weren't shocked by them, I would say. We know in rodents that white matter also sort of changes and increases in the first and second trimester, and I think it stalls a little bit in the third. And so we kind of saw that too. And then similarly, that sort of fine tuning of circuits in animals. While we see this decreased pattern, and we can't say at the resolution of an MRI machine in human brain, whether that's fine tuning of, neurons or not. It's a similar sort of pattern, and these literatures can blend into each other and are definitely not contrasting.
Cool. Okay, that's good to know. So for people who don't really have any neuroscience exposure or any psychology background, could you just say a little bit more about what gray matter does exactly and what white matter does, just so people get a sort of
Yeah.
richer sense of the depth of your finding?
Yeah, I will try to put my neuroanatomy hat on, but it's been so many years. But to say, gray matter houses the neurons, the cells of the central nervous system, and they are the ones that are, releasing excitatory and inhibitory signals to communicate and synchronize with the whole entire brain itself. So that's like the cell activity is actually in the gray matter. It's and we looked at both cortical and subcortical regions, but the cortex sits on the outside of the brain. You can see if you've seen an image where it's a bunch of what looks like wrinkles of a walnut, that's where the gray matter exists. And those are where we house the neurons themselves, the function of the brain. And the white matter is myelinating the axons between these neurons itself for signal conduction. So if you have a lot of white matter, you can think of it as like I can have an electrical signal that goes from one neuron to another really rapidly. And if it's decreasing in that sort of myelination, that's going to be a slower signal. And we rely a lot, especially in periods where we need to be communicating with other parts of our brain and multitasking and having higher order cognition, we need to have a lot of very quick connections between neurons to synchronize our thoughts, our actions, our motor, our sensory, our association parts of our brain together. And so we see sort of a decrease in the gray matter, which can be an indicator for decreased amount of neurons. We don't know. We can't at that level get at what this really is. But we also see this increase in white matter, so the signals. Maybe there's less connections, but they're faster. And that's why we think of this in the context of a fine tuning of a circuit or a pruning in a way that might be beneficial, and how we see it in other parts of development. If people have heard of the word neuroplasticity, our ability for our brain to adapt, that's what we think this is an indicator of. We're going to take our foot off of the brakes and allow new connections or change of connections, change in our brain for a specific reason. And for pregnancy, it's in response to these rise in hormones. And of course, from the evolutionary perspective, that's there for child rearing as well. And we see, we can see similar sorts of decreases even in fathers before and after they have a child. So this isn't necessarily exclusive to pregnancy, but the degree is much different for sure.
Whoa. Okay, so happens to the dad too?
It's the funny thing is
Oh,
that when you're studying before someone has a kid and then after, there's a lot of things that are going on, right? As you know, a lot of sleep changes, movement changes, all of that. And so that's the other interesting thing when we're studying this is what is actually a mechanistic change like we see in animals versus even in pregnancy your patterns of behavior change, and we are flexible human beings. Our brain is plastic, and so is it you're moving differently, maybe less, maybe more. Your sleep is changing, your hydration is changing. Some of our findings can also be sort of physiologically based. We have every part of your body is changing. Your brain is no exception. So there could be compression of tissue, which could make it look smaller or not. But it's not the only explanation because things remain sort of etched in your brain for years and years later. But in fathers too, this is work by Darby Saxby at University of Southern California, Magdalena Martinez Garcia. They're great researchers in this space. They also studied this effect in fathers. And so that like then an important thing to note here and for listeners to note too is that you don't have to experience pregnancy to have your brain adapt and be able to be able to do caregiving activities, that's for sure. But there is something physiologically demanding of pregnancy itself to lead to changes in the brain. And, this happens to 140 million women annually worldwide. If this were something where it's like your brain is shrinking and atrophying, we wouldn't, and it was deleterious, we wouldn't be having this happen to everyone. It's there for a purpose.
Yeah, yeah, that's so amazing. Wow. So you just said a second ago you can get some of this fine tuning through caregiving, but the totality of it really does come from the actual act of gestating. So that raises a question that might be beyond this, beyond the scope of your own research, but a lot of people who will want to listen to this are people who maybe don't yet have kids and they're worried about it. I mean, I go on all these job blogs and, sort of discipline specific blogs in my field, looking for advice on work-life balance. And what I find there more often than not is not advice, but like a kind of panic, actually. People are like, I'm most concerned about baby brain. I'm most concerned about how this is going to affect me. Like, does anybody have any advice? And then there's like a list of comments of people being like, me too. And so I think people, who are intellectuals by profession and in that sense have kind of monetized their brain are a little loath in some cases to put it in a situation that could permanently or even just for a long period alter it. And
Yeah.
so, but my own experience with this, as I said a minute ago, is that actually there has been some what you've now described as fine tuning. So for people who are kind of considering, should I not think about having kids if I'm committed to being an academic, can they get some of that fine tuning without going through this period of brain development? Or is this really, the way that our nature is set up, such that that fine tuning is really just going to happen through gestation? If you're a woman.
I mean, the simple answer is that when you are then presented with, say you had a surrogate and you're presented with a baby and all of a sudden you need to take care of it, you need to wake up in the middle of the night, your brain is going to very much adapt to that and be able to do that. Grandparents do this all the time. Non-gestational partners have these adaptations and success in this behavior. So it's not a requirement. Like this is a very important point because I see this too. People very scared of so-called mommy brain, pregnancy fog, pregnancy brain, or whatever. And it reminds me a little bit of there was press coverage of our paper that sort of hinted at that tagline. And I did go through the comments because I guess I'm a masochist, and it was most women being like, well, yeah, I could have told you my brain is changing, which really feeds into this like frustration of why are we just quantifying this or studying this now? And my response sort of to all of that is two-part. And one is that anytime your brain is changing or in a transition state, you're gonna feel the effects of it. And even though I don't love the term mommy brain or baby brain or anything like that, because I think it is steeped a bit in misogyny, I don't want to simultaneously ignore the fact that women are subjectively saying that they are feeling differently, and you can't ignore that. And of course, and especially in the United States, we do not have good systems in place to support working parents and working moms and flexibility during pregnancy, and of course, anything after that. So that's at play for sure. But the other thing that I like to think about, or I like to say to people at least, of my friends who come to me and say, I have to work at a high multitasking rate. I have to be optimized. I can't, like, whether it's sleep or if I'm pregnant and I'm feeling all of this fog, I have to still work. And I like to just provide an alternative perspective, and everything can be true at once, which is think of it as with an abundance mindset of adaptation, cognitive adaptation. So, my favorite example, of course, is when people are saying, I have, postpartum brain fog. and I can't remember things. Oh, I'm losing my brain is shrinking. I like to remind them, you may not remember where your keys are or who you're talking to or to text someone back, but you have so much information on when your baby slept, what their diaper looked like, how much they drank, and that is cognitive as well. And so your brain is able to, flexibly switch its attention when it needs to. And maybe in certain periods, it's saying, I don't need to actually pay attention to that. That's not going to go into my long-term memory. Here's where I'm at. Here's what the demand is. And that is still cognitive as well. And that is powerful in the brain. But our findings are really there to, at first glance with just this single subject is really to say, pay attention because the brain is changing. What's normal? What's the normal amount of change? What might be different between people who say have severe memory complaints or not? And let's try and understand that. And the last thing I want to add is that the pregnancy postpartum period is something you survive. It's hard. There's no way of getting around that. But the data we do have from sort of cognitive performance a few years after postpartum and into aging is that it's actually protective and beneficial for your brain. And you can think about it in the terms in the concept of you have 4 kids. Think about how much is going on in your mind at all times, probably for the rest of your life, but especially in the next several decades. That's cognitive activity, that's cognitive engagement, and that's really beneficial for the brain. And, of course, there can be extremes on either side, but we know even there was a study that came out a couple years ago that used data from the UK Biobank. This is a huge population level data set from the countries in the United Kingdom where they studied brain age, how old does your brain look relative to your chronological age with respect to how many pregnancies you've had. And they found that more pregnancies you had, the younger looking your brain was. And of course, it's not probably just that you went through that pregnancy, but everything that comes after that. So that's sort of the positive light I like to shed on it a little bit. And our understanding is that the brain has adapted and it's developed and it's been plastic again, and those are usually good things, but it is simultaneously hard when ideally you need to give yourself grace, but we don't live in an ecosystem where that's really all that available.
Wow. Wow. So much to ask there, but this is so true to my experience.
Yeah.
I think I like to pick on the term baby brain too, because it makes it sound as if it's just a purely negative experience. And there, of course, there are things like it's annoying not to remember what you're about to say. It's annoying to have like less inhibition and then something crazy just comes out of your mouth. Like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
annoying. But so I actually did a whole episode just like filming myself in each trimester through a pregnancy. Like, hey, this is what baby brain's feeling like, because a lot of people on these boards were saying they didn't know what to expect. And so there's a lot of that negativity, but I'm definitely noticing, as you just said, like the more children I have had, and mine have been close together too, um, the more my ability to flip between tasks has gone up, and the
Mhm.
creativity has gone up, and like just I feel like my general, yeah, the connections are coming faster when I turn to the
Mhm.
academic stuff. So you've enumerated some of these things that I have experienced. Can you maybe flesh out a little bit more, like what does brain age actually look like for someone who's, you know, uh, an intellectual professionally? Like what is how is that going to, if you can say, manifest in their actual daily academic work?
In the concept of how it relates with parenting, or just without being having an experience of parenting, or what do you mean?
So women who have gestated and have had the baby, what are there any, like, how do I word this? Are there any sort of cognitive benefits you think
Mhm.
they can experience or anticipate, either during gestation or in that postpartum window, um, from having had a child?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is anecdotal with the women that I have spoken to. in that they have found that they've worked more efficiently, they have more boundaries of their time, and so they have to pick and choose what tasks they work on, and they actually find that they are more efficient there. Um, so that is sort of anecdotally what I have seen with women, fellow peers who are scientists or are professor and or professors who have to have a hard stop at 5. They actually, it appears to me that they're getting things done a lot more efficiently than, say, me, who has not had a child and is, dilly-dallying around. I think the concept of time differs, and that can change how you go about your day. But more broadly, this hasn't been really separated, this data hasn't really been separated out by people who are full-time employees or maybe staying at home, but we see, especially out of the early postpartum, sort of a cognitive advantage in many different domains. I don't want to get the domains wrong. There are higher order domains such as memory and things like that. And I would really encourage people to check out the work by Winnie Orchard, who has looked at cognition in parents and mothers over the midlife period. But she has seen like cognitive advantages of women who have gone through this. And I think it just speaks to, there's a hard period of time where you're exhausted and you're maybe not thinking, you're just not the same person that you were beforehand, and that's okay too, and your brain is changing and you're doing that, but you get to a period where you may come up for air and your day-to-day life just looks slightly differently. And I think there is this cognitive advantage of, okay, I'm in my era of task switching and ordering what's important, what's not important. And that really, I think, comes through in how you work. But there
Yeah.
isn't an extensive amount of data that, at least that I'm familiar with, that really catalogs that a bit. I think it would be really interesting for us to kind of do that work and get narratives even from people and their experiences and track their psychology and their brain over, well into when they go back to work and things like that.
Yeah. Wow. That's so interesting. Are any of these cognitive advantages that you've come across in the literature similar to something like creativity or sort of novel thinking, anything like that in your
That's an
experience?
interesting question. Not off of the top of my head, but I think there's an intersection there. And maybe someone, I don't want to say that that hasn't been done. I'm not familiar with it. A lot of the time, we're doing these very typical cognitive batteries that I think have largely excluded either like hierarchical or like planning that requires a lot of problem solving and creativity, or just outright creative questionnaires or tasks maybe to get at that. I think that's not as much of the mainstream that we assess, but that's a really interesting point. And it makes sense of where you have this period of neuroplasticity and things are changing in your brain and they're permanently etched now, and then behavior and your lifestyle changes too. And does it open up something else? And this is not to, again, I don't want to pull this back to psychedelics, but that's kind of the idea there, right? So no, the plasticity you experience and the reorganization of your brain you experience, even in short, acute ways on psychedelics, opens up creativity. So it would be cool to see if some of those changes that we're seeing in those experiments overlap a lot with the regions we're seeing undergo a lot of change there, or just asking that question. And we started with a single subject, but the University of California has expanded this maternal brain project where there's many women. I think now they're at 12 women and their partners who are being scanned over pregnancy. And so that's something we can maybe encourage to add in, or these questions, or even audio recordings would be really cool of women through pregnancy into postpartum, as you were doing, just self-documentation. And then we can use all these naturalistic language models to look at affect, to look at words that they're choosing well into, 2 to 3 years post-birth, and see how our internal monologue has changed maybe, and all of that. I think that's ripe for exploration.
Yeah, wow. So much to be done here on this topic. Can you just say a little bit more about the analogy between psychedelics and pregnancy? I'm not sure I totally grasp it. Were you saying that they're similar in terms of the extent of the brain change, or were there actual qualitative similarities in how the brain changes?
It's largely not, I can't answer either of those, but more so that there's a vested interest right now, both in we're coming to this interest in pregnancy, that and how the brain changes during pregnancy, maternal brain neuroscience, and at the same time the influence of psychedelics on the brain and how even like small doses of that can lead to tangible change in the brain. And so our team is always like wanting to ask basically the questions you posed of like, what are those similar adaptations? Are they not? Are they doing similar things? Are they not? Because both are just wild changes that are occurring to the brain, like the highest estrogen you're ever going to have in your life during pregnancy. And then there's all of these changes in the brain. And there's also a lot that is changing with psychedelics. And I know that literature very little, but just this idea that these two things are really hot right now. And maybe we can actually look at how those intersect, just as a way to say, what are things we do in our lives that lead to so much brain change or brain response, whether it's traditionally gestationally or psychedelics for therapeutics, sort of just a fun future step to to benchmark. I think that's what's really important with the pregnancy findings is we have to benchmark this against other periods of change. And people have with adolescent and adolescent brain development and shown that there actually are similar adaptations to similar degrees, sort of at what you were asking. But now can we ask this with a bunch of other sorts of things too?
Oh, cool. That's really interesting. I can confirm that pregnancy is groovy.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I don't want to take up too much of your time, but just another quick question. So postpartum, we spoke a little bit about this, but I think in your study you looked 2 years after you said, right?
Up to 2 years. Yeah.
Up to 2 years. Okay. Is there much literature on the period after that? Like how longitudinal does this data get in the broader, literature?
Yeah, so a couple of really interesting things about the postpartum findings. There are a lot of labs that are dedicated to studying postpartum exclusively and looking at it, from 4 weeks after birth, every few weeks to several years later. And then some prior work, the first sort of major pre to post pregnancy study that came out in 2017, so not that long ago, that studied, I think maybe 100 women before birth and then immediately after. They actually followed a subset of that cohort up to 6 years postpartum and found that the brain had not fully ever, the brain volume itself had never gone back to those preconception rates to indicate that this might be a permanent etching and that you're never, that recovery is not going to just come back right away. And that's really interesting when you also think about the UK Biobank findings I was talking about, where those women are like 60, 70 years old. But in our work, we really only study them, and the time points get a little bit spread out more when we get to a year, year and a half. And a lot of that is just feasibility of the study itself. But we have some evidence to say that this isn't, you know, this is pretty common in this sort of slower recovery. And in other groups' work, they have found that that rate of recovery of gray matter volume, and recovery is its own biting word, what postpartum brain trajectories look like differ by which region of the brain you're looking at. And there is really early preliminary evidence from this group in Spain to suggest that that might also differ by delivery type, cesarean versus vaginal delivery, and that might be just due to the massive physiological changes that could be different there, swelling or things like that. But it's not ubiquitous across the whole brain that give birth and then all the tissue changes the same. It can differ by networks, and that's a whole nother thing of where we saw the strongest effects, or people find the strongest effects in the brain across this perinatal period, is largely in regions that fall along the default mode network. If people have heard of the default mode network, our brain is kind of organized into these major networks, visual, motor. And then when you're not responding to a major task and you're kind of letting your mind wander, you're doing self-reflection, you're doing theory of mind, thinking about someone else, someone else's needs that are not your own, that belongs and encompasses that network. And we see that one changing the most. And that makes a lot of sense because we know that's what parenting really is. And those are areas really sensitive to steroid hormones. So that has in the paper I'm referencing from Susanna Carmona's group, that network itself had the most decrease and slowest recovery rate in postpartum.
Is a default mode network, is it at all responsible for more abstract thinking, theoretical stuff, like the sort of intellectual work intellectuals do?
It is an association network, so it isn't, thought of more traditionally as, one that's involved in higher order thinking, higher order cognition. I'm not sure in terms of exactly abstract thinking, whether it's there. Where I could think it plays a role in that, and maybe I really only study it in the context of like self-referential memory, episodic memory theory of mind, but its activity compared to, say, an attention network, those relationships, like can you toggle and focus your attention on something there, or are you getting distracted by your own mind wandering or rumination or something like that? Those relationships might be where that really comes out in terms of creativity or abstract thinking. Maybe you can exclusively think about something without your frontal control network coming in to say, we have to get moving on something, or that chair is only a chair. It's not going to be representative of anything else. Or so that's probably more of a question of what our brain dynamics between networks look like communication across the whole brain and different regions involved there.
Cool. And when you say the default mode network shrinks down and doesn't come back as much as the other ones, you still mean though that the white matter goes up in these areas, right? So it's not just loss, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This study that I'm referencing didn't look at white matter in that way. They were just looking at gray matter volume of those regions itself. So it doesn't mean that everything is decreasing there. But and again, that what we would assume or take away or interpret from those findings is that it's the most impacted network. It's undergoing the most fine tuning, and largely when you think of fine tuning, you think of something else in tandem, kind of helping to improve that fine tuning. And for us, that was increased myelination.
Nice. Cool. So I don't want to steal more of your time than I asked for. If I may follow up with one more question.
Yeah.
So, hmm, a lot of academics won't have four going on five kids as I do, so this isn't totally relevant to a lot of them, but I do think some of them try to have their children close together. And
Mhm.
so is there any kind of compounded effect of doing this whole thing more than once, close together in a row, or also more than once and then close together? Does that change things at all, or is this just a question that we're too early? We can't say.
Well, it's such an important question because it's the most common way in which people who choose to have children live their lives, right? Or in the fact that they have often more than one child. We know very little about what a second pregnancy in the brain looks like. Like we are only scratching the surface of a first-time mom, and there's work that's going to come out soon to analyze that. And I served as a reviewer, so I will let that data speak for itself. But that's like the first paper in 2026 that has actually quantified what the brain looks like during a first pregnancy, and then in a separate group of people, what it looks like in the second pregnancy, to ask that question of are the magnitudes the same? Do you keep having the same pattern where your first kid, second kid, third kid? That's an open question. To speak to the other thing you're mentioning too is like the time between. It's an interesting one because if the brain is still doing its adaptation or plasticity, and you get pregnant again, what does that look like? Does that change the trajectory at all? That's a really important question. We know that there was this really powerful study that came out, I think in Science or Science Advances last year, that just looked at blood data of women throughout pregnancy and how long it takes for like cholesterol or your traditional clinical labs to kind of recover into a preconception range. And it, for many of them, I think even cholesterol, it was more than a year or something. We should ask that question for the brain as well. And then there's all of the questions of what might be the best route? Does it matter if your brain kind of gets that time to come back, but it doesn't always, and it doesn't, there's evidence to say it's a permanent etching, so maybe it doesn't. And that's where I think we got to rely heavily on cognitive outcomes, behavioral outcomes, risk for, anxiety, OCD, depression, and all of that's probably going to be the biggest factor to ask. But from the brain perspective, we know very little about successive pregnancies,
Wow. Well, I
which
mean, that's
is shocking, depressing,
yeah, that's pretty crazy, to be
frustrating.
honest.
Yeah.
But you are really at the tip of the spear, as far as I can tell, in trying to fill in these huge gaps. And so I thank you for your time. I think people who are listening will be so, encouraged, frankly, to just know, just to have that knowledge on hand does a lot to reduce some of the anxiety that comes with what is already a hugely life-changing experience. So there's no need for us to live in the dark if there are people like you who want to do this research. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. Both as an academic and as a mom, I just thank you for the work
Yeah.
that you do and for coming to share some of it with us today.
Of course, women are powerful, and it's a hard period, but it's a resilience period. It's a neuroplastic period. It's powerful. Hormones in the brain are powerful. It doesn't mean it's easy, but there's the last thing is there's evidence that it helps you down the road from the cognitive perspective, ignoring all the facts of happiness and joy and love and all of that. But we're on it. We're trying to correct course, and we're trying to, we always say the more we understand about the maternal brain, the more we can provide relief and understanding. And it sometimes is just enough to say, it's not all in your head. Your brain is changing like any other brain development period. So understand that, give yourself grace, and, you know, good luck, and it'll be okay. And this is not a bad thing. If this were bad, we wouldn't have be programmed to have this effect show. It's one of the most reliable findings in neuroscience, at least when you look pre to post pregnancy. So it's there for a reason.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that encouragement
All
and
right.
for your time and your knowledge and your research. That's so
Yeah.
good, so cool.
Well, lovely to chat with you, and thank you for the interest in sharing it with your listeners.